Well, good evening, folk. It's so lovely to see so many people right here in front of us, the Faculty of Health Sciences Marie Curie venue, but also we recognize many, many people who are joining us online from all over the world. And it's wonderful to be able to see people in these two contexts. But personally, I really prefer seeing folk in 3 dimensions. So thank you for those of you who've made it into the venue. I also want to say my name is Ian Jandrell. I'm a Deputy Vice Chancellor. It's my privilege to have some level of interaction with this particular faculty. So I have the honor of being your host tonight and to be able to introduce to you the folk in the procession. You would have seen the inaugurating professor, Professor Matthew Chersich. You would have seen the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, Professor Shabia Mahdi, and then Professor Helen Rees, who you will meet later when she proposes the vote of thanks. But folk, we're here tonight to see the inaugural address of an inaugurating professor. In fact, our opportunity tonight is to confirm that Professor Chersich can in fact profess. And that's what we're all looking forward to. And of course, we have no doubt that that is the case because of the standing that he already holds in the academic community. But it's an opportunity for friends, family, and colleagues to see our colleague stand up in front of all of us and share his thoughts as the inaugurating professor. As I said, it's an absolute privilege for me to be able to host this evening, but what I'd now like to do is to ask the Dean of the Faculty, Professor Shabia Mahdi, to introduce the inaugurating professor. Professor Mahdi.
Thank you, Prof. General, and good evening, everyone. So it's a real pleasure for me as Dean of Faculty of Health Sciences to introduce Prof. Matthew Chersich. Matthew is a research professor at Wits and a visiting professor at the University of Ghent in Belgium. His career covers more than 20 years working in public health research in Africa and with WHO and other international organizations. He has spent the past 10 years working at Wits RHI, the Reproductive Health Institute, and previously at the Center for Health Policy, the Perinatal HIV Research Unit, and at Rehema Musa Mother and Child Hospital. Matthew completed his MBBCH in 1998 at Wits and a public health master's at the School of Hygiene and Tropical, at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and doctoral studies at the University of Ghent in Belgium. More recently, and Matthew, I'm not too sure what the relevance of this is, he studied the Italian language and attended a master's level course on Franciscan studies for 3 years in Assisi, Italy. Interestingly, he sees a medical profession as an opportunity to travel, and he has spent a fair amount of time in interesting environments, having worked in Durban, London, Geneva, Mombasa in Kenya, Ghent in Belgium, and Assisi, Italy. He maintains close links with WHO, having contributed to 14 WHO guidelines or monologues, and he was a contributing author to the Africa chapter of the 6th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. His work on climate change centers on assessing the impacts of climate change on maternal and newborn health, adaptation interventions, and climate activism. He's leading the NIH HEAT Center, a new data science initiative across Africa within the NIH DSI Africa program. To date, he has authored more than 190 publications with an H index of 53. So I think for anyone that has been around at Wits for the past year or so, many of you will become familiar with the name of Matthew and his agitation for Wits to become more proactive in terms of going green, as well as when it comes to issues of divesting from energy-intense companies. So Matthew, welcome, congratulations, and over to you.
Thank you, Prof, and thanks everyone. It's very good to be here. I entered here around 30 years ago as a first-year medical student, and my son didn't say this, but it took 30 years later to get to this point, and he probably thinks that I'm a little bit slow, which might well be correct. So let's start. I want to start by just outlining this figure. So at the moment, the world is around 1.1 degrees warmer than in the pre-industrial period. So over the last 2 centuries, the world has warmed by 1.1 degrees. We're now at a point which we can refer to as climate choice. Okay, we now have to choose what our climate will, what trajectory our climate will take. It seems like the thing is overheating. So we're in a phase now called climate choice, where we will be able to choose which way the climate goes. Should I pause, or are we good? You know, we've rehearsed so many times, and it was always fine. It's climate change, yeah, exactly. Are we good, Stanley? Okay. I think we should be good. But what I was saying is there's a phase now where we can still choose the climate that we will experience and that we'll hand to our children. But at a certain point, that level of choice will disappear, and the climate will cascade. And that's nature's tipping point, at which point a whole series of events will happen. And we will no longer have choice over the climate that we will experience. So where did all this begin? What is a medic doing studying climatology? So it all began about 7 years ago when my family and Dylan was quite young. We moved to Italy to Assisi for 3 years. And we were living in really, it's a tiny little village in the green heart of Italy. And that's the place where St. Francis was born, and that's the basilica where he's buried. But we stayed 5 kilometers outside of even a tiny village in a very small hamlet with 3 or 4 subsistence farmers who lived really in very close harmony with nature. So it would have been it didn't take long after me arriving to decide that this is a new field that I want to enter. But I was quite concerned. I thought, how am I going to explain this to Helen? So I had a long list of reasons why or how I might explain this. But I got to not even the first reason, and Helen said, go for it. Follow this path. So at that point, I needed to decide, because climate change and health has 4 large... Are we good? No. Maybe we should pause for a minute. But let's also maybe check how it's doing online. Do you think so? Yeah?
But we need to stop this one.
Shame, man. They've done... Let's just check how the Zoom people are doing.
Seeing one of you is better.
How's the Zoom, guys? Are they good? Okay, so let's use the side ones. Good. So climate change and health there's around 4 areas. So I needed to then choose. The changes in the climate affect drought and poverty and social disruption. This is the kind of breakdown in nature when areas that were livable now become unlivable, or where you need to change crops, or there's this migration of populations. But for me, that felt an area that I couldn't really grapple with. It's highly complex. The other area where climate affects health is this damage to infrastructure. In other words, where the health system and all the infrastructure is now destroyed. That's kind of disaster medicine. And for me, again, it was an area that I couldn't fully understand, or I couldn't fully grapple with how I would enter or move into that area. The third way that the climate affects health is through shifts in infectious disease patterns. And really an interesting idea, very important, as, for example, malaria will now shift into higher altitudes to non-immune populations, and a whole range of shift in infectious diseases, because almost all pathogens are temperature sensitive. In fact, all of nature is temperature sensitive, although humans think we perhaps are not. So the third area that is a direct impact. So as temperatures rise, that has major impacts on humans. And that was the area that I settled on. The next question was what part of heat to examine. In many parts of the world, the focus has been on people above the age of 65. So for example, someone who's 90 years old who has chronic lung disease, how does that person cope when there's the temperatures are higher and they've got this additional physiological load? But the area that I thought would be quite interesting and made sense of my background was heat and maternal health, and the intersections between these two. So this wasn't set against, it was an area that I had some sense of from maternal health, but it was also the area that made sense of our university, which had done remarkable work from the 1980s with Helen Leyburn and then Prof. Mitchell, who's in the room, and Justice Hofmeyer also did a lot of work in this area. And one of the most notable studies in the early 90s was when they measured the actual fetal temperature. So they put a probe into the fetus of different animals and measured then the fetal maternal temperature gradient. And they noted then the fetus was around 0.5 degree warmer or higher temperature than maternal temperature. And that might not seem like a lot, but if maternal temperature rises to 40 degrees with a fever, then that baby can be 40.5, and that makes a big difference physiologically. So the other reason we chose maternal health is that maternal health is at the core of most interventions in health, at least initially. So HIV program started in mother-to-child transmission, nutrition, malaria. The vaccine started in children and then moved into adolescents and now into adults. So it really is the core, the platform for all health services. So it's a very strategic choice. So this is now I'm presenting some of the work from our projects. This is the first project, which is in Kenya. And this is the qualitative work, the qualitative component of that study. So here we're asking, what did women say? This was in the rural area of Kenya. We also did a similar project in the rural area of Burkina Faso. What did women say about raised temperatures? So the one woman said, in the heat you deliver a baby who's deformed. And we did a systematic review that showed there was about 18 studies that showed the same thing. At higher temperatures during the first trimester, you have higher rates of congenital anomalies. The next quote I show is, in my village there's a woman who lost her baby recently. She didn't have an existing high blood pressure, but after the season, which they were referring to as prolonged dry weather, her pressure went up. She went to the hospital, but it was discovered the fetus had already been affected by that heat. And before its birth, the fetus had already been burnt. So the feeling from this woman was this prolonged period of heat was dangerous to their fetus. A study done by our team and colleagues at the London School and other groups showed it's really fascinating. This was the first study of this kind that had been done in Africa. This showed that temperatures above 23 degrees, that's on the y-axis, was associated with the 1.5 higher hazards of preeclampsia or high blood pressure during pregnancy. And this is that first, then at lower temperatures, this is that first period of pregnancy, the first trimester. And this makes sense physiologically because that is a period during which the placenta is vascularized and beginning to grow. And an insult at that point is related to the development of hypertension later on in pregnancy. In this study, as in many others, during the second trimester, it's a relatively calm period where heat and other insults, in fact, have very little impact. The uterus and the baby remains relatively within a stable window at this time. The slight decrease in blood pressure did make sense because you get vasodilation when it's warmer. So that there was some good physiological understanding for that dip. And then there was a little spike towards the end of pregnancy. And again, this is to be expected. And I'll show you in the next slide, when it's warm at the end of, or the next slides, and it's warm at the end of pregnancy, then you do get this inflammatory change. So this was a really remarkable study. I think it's consistent with the other, there's about 10 similar studies throughout the world. But still, this was, I think, made an important contribution because it shows impacts in Africa. So then what did women in our studies say about heat exposure in late pregnancy and around childbirth? The one woman in Kenya, or the mother-in-law in Kenya, reported the fetus, sometimes it does not feel like playing because of high temperature. Up until when she delivers and finds peace, then she is peaceful. And this is the notion, I think, that the women were saying, is that they felt that during warm periods, the fetus was in a hostile environment. The fetus was in the uterus during these periods, was in a difficult place. And in fact, there's a study by the colleagues at London School which followed women in the Gambia working outdoors, and they would do ultrasounds during the course of the day in hot periods, and they documented the same thing. So these women were reporting what we're showing, and we hope to show in our future studies as well. This is a paper that's underway by Fiona Scorgi, the anthropologist in our team. And it says, in heat, women report difficulty in pushing. This refers to labor. So there's a debate amongst the people working in this field. What part of pregnancy is dangerous? Is it the first trimester? Is it the last few weeks, or is it during childbirth? I'm really interested in the last few weeks of pregnancy. Someone like Justice Hofmeyr is really is leader in fetal medicine throughout the world, really. And his view is that intrapartum is the most dangerous. And there's others that feel the first trimester is the most important. And this has important implications for, over time, we will begin to advise women when is the most safe time to conceive. And it's probably around autumn, but the timing of insult will have important implications also for interventions, etc. So the next part I'm moving on to, again, heat in the third trimester. One of the women said, in the heat you can deliver a baby who has not yet reached its time. And here she's referring to preterm birth. So myself and others, we did a large systematic review and around 50 articles that looked at heat and preterm birth. And it's largely consistent that when it's warmer, in those last few weeks of pregnancy, your chances of going into labor earlier are raised. I'll show you one example of the increase in your odds of preterm birth during heat waves. And here, when they showed in these studies, the findings were consistent of around a 1.16 higher odds of having preterm birth during a heat wave as opposed to other periods. So this is all very interesting, and that's the quantitative and the qualitative evidence, which seems to be consistent. But how would all of this happen? What would be the physiological mechanisms behind these impacts? So the first area is endocrine activation. So what I'm showing you here, there's 4 ways that heat might result in preterm birth. And the first is endocrine activation. During periods of hot weather, there's a large change in your hormonal milieu. The second area is oxidative stress. So this is the non-inflammatory stress. It's this heat shock proteins and a whole range of other inflammatory mediators that are released during periods of high raised temperatures. You also get changes in placental perfusion. So when you go through warm periods, the maternal circulation tries to protect the fetus against this warmth and restricts blood flow to the fetus. And there's a large shift in placental transfusion because that's the main avenue through which the fetus can dissipate heat. And the fetus is generating a lot of heat because there's a massive metabolic processes underway throughout pregnancy. So really changes in placental perfusion are also important. And the last area is of course infection. So when the temperatures are higher, you get increased rates of almost all infections, foodborne infections, waterborne, vector-borne. They all shift with temperature increase. So you might get a change in the vaginal microbiome. And in turn, there's this very important area which we are beginning to examine, which is around gene expression and epigenetics. So when there's a change in temperature, then you'll also get a change in the epigenetics, and that is what programs. It can have implications for programming of your future life. It's this Barker hypothesis that your well-being is then determined by your epigenetics or your in utero environment. So together, all of these 4 areas that I've described, they all result in inflammation, both maternal and fetal. And this is important because really inflammation is what triggers preterm birth. This is the biological tipping point, the factors that maintain women in pregnancy and the factors that then result in labor. These remain in balance, in this very delicate balance. And the inflammation is what then triggers labor. It's a triggering or the pro-parturition occurrence. So heat is we hope to examine, there's pathways A to K. And in the study, you would look at all the biomarkers for each of these individual pathways and see how they change at higher temperatures. We've also looked at heat and infants, and this is an important area. The systematic review showed relatively consistent findings that at higher temperatures you get a change in infant health. We also then used that data to understand how many additional child deaths would you get in Africa as temperature rises. So very interesting and very important to look at both maternal and child health and heat. So will data science provide the answers? What I've shown you is you can see that there are areas that we're beginning to answer. There are quite a few pieces of this puzzle that are holding together. But there's a lot of information that's missing. And our work at the moment is really, one of our key areas is the NIH Heat Center. It's a large 5-year project with a team across Africa and 2 sites in the US, where we're using data science. It is called individual participant data, where we are pooling all trials and cohorts across Africa. All of that data gets pooled, and then you use data science to really understand these causal pathways in incredible detail. I see Scott Hazel is here as well, and he's involved in a similar project. And you really are trying to understand this in ways, and this will be the largest data science project in this area throughout the world. And I really hope that over the next few years we will be able to unpack all these key questions. So once we know that there's a large problem, and we know the problem will get worse as temperature increases throughout the world. So what can one do about that? What is the interventional framework? And we've developed this over the last year or 2. So we think the interventions need to be at multiple levels: the individual household, the facility, community, workplace, district, province, and international. And then acting on each of those levels are a set of components, a whole range of components that one can consider when designing an intervention. So the first one is the health system and new health services. So the current health system doesn't really have a cadre worker who understands climate change or understands heat. And this now, what we mean here by new services would be a lay health worker, for example, who knows that there's a woman who's got twins, who's 45 years old, who has a TB before, and she's at high risk for heat disease, and during pregnancy, she knows these women and she knows how to assist them, to provide water, cold water, and other interventions. The second area is the built environment. This is a large focus of work. This is where you would take a facility and that has a very poor heat resistance, or a household. And many of these, if you think of informal settlement or health facilities, many of them are around 4 to 5 degrees warmer indoors than outdoors. And that's a big problem if you're in labor, or if you have cardiorespiratory concerns, or if you're an infant. If it's warm out, if it's 40 outside, it means it's 44 degrees inside. So the built environment is clearly very important. Poverty reduction and equity is a key area to intervene on, and nature-based solutions. Here, this is often reversed to as greening, or the presence of trees, or blue or green areas. And this is, if you have trees or nature-based, if you increase the prevalence of those, you really can lower temperature markedly. And the policy actions, and there is increasing policy at national and international level, and behavior change and awareness is the final area. And I'm going to show you an example of one of our projects where we are doing behavior change interventions. So if that's our framework, how would you then go about selecting an intervention? Okay? So the starting point is qualitative and quantitative research. And here you would have interviews, with in-depth interviews or key informant interviews, and focus groups, focus group discussions, ethnography, and in some of these cases, the anthropologist or qualitative worker or field worker remains in the facility and examines the circumstances and what are the heat-related behaviors and water availability, etc. And then quantitative surveys. After that, we do thermal modeling. And here you're measuring temperature in great detail. So this would be among a pregnant woman, where you're measuring the temperature on her skin. You have swallowable devices to measure her core temperature. And we also measure the temperature then in the household. You measure both indoors and a few meters outdoors. And in facilities, in a similar way, you measure the indoor temperature. And then you have, we take weather station data and satellite data, called remote sensing. Further, the next step is then cost effectiveness, where we have this trade-off. You saw that immense framework of intervention, potential interventions. You've now measured what does the community say, what are the options. And you've considered, well, how would this building, if you did an alteration and put a window on that side of the building, how would it alter this thermal envelope? So you have to trade off these costs in your approach. And also we've started to talk about we need to take emissions into account in all of our work. And I think that's quite novel, and we've begun to add that to the package of ways we need to, the things we need to think about when selecting an intervention. Finally, we do co-design, where you have workshops with the beneficiaries, community members, and other stakeholders. And these have been done in both of our studies. We have a series of workshops with quite a structured approach to understanding and designing these programs. Then the researchers meet together and you finalize the intervention. I'll give you one example now of our work in Kenya, where our intervention has started. In this case, it's a single component intervention. Let's just finish the animation, marvelous. So this is the single component intervention. After the field work had been done and we understand the needs of the community, we then decided that the key focus would be on pregnant women who work outdoors in physical labor and until the late stages of pregnancy. So a woman in the picture, for example, would have to walk several kilometers every day, often more than once a day, to the source of water. She'd have to refill her water container and carry that container then back to her household. So the intervention here was to get the community together and all the stakeholders, the mother-in-laws, the male partners, etc., and together to decide, is there not a way that we can change these structures and these behaviors through community mobilization, but also these repeated facilitated group discussions. And we had a video as well that we'd show, we'd have a group discussion in the community to really try and shift behaviors. But that's a simple intervention. And the question is always, certainly in behavior change research, does a simple intervention have sufficient ability to overcome, to be effective? Or do you need a much more intensive intervention? So in our EU High Horizons project, which will start later this year, we do multi-component interventions. And these are now demonstration projects. So the first one is a little bit of effectiveness research. Now we're doing demonstration projects. That's the next level of work. And our study includes all those areas highlighted. We don't have any poverty reduction work. And here, the area that I would really like is pregnancy support grants, so financial support during pregnancy. We've done some work previously on that. And I think going forward, that's an area that I'd like to include in our work. So let me just give you one practical example of what this would entail. And this could be a household or a health facility. The roof we would paint in reflective paint so that the light gets reflected off. Greenery around the facility. You make windows, for example, water sprays, and someone who has the ability to, who has the knowledge, who can then assist women during pregnancy, for example. So that's the package of services that one might transform households or facilities. Then at a certain point, once we've got that evidence from either single or for multi-component, you then reach a programmatic tipping point. This is at a point beyond which you can now move into programs. You reach a sufficient evidence, and programs can then be district-wide and heading towards national programs. And this is a point where I think we're getting pretty close to at the moment, to really saying we need these district-wide. And this is analogous to the HIV PEPFAR or Global Fund projects. We have these really district-wide, and then of course after that you then move towards a national program. So at the moment in climate change, there's some funding concerns, particularly around health. And health is not yet been included in many of the climate change adaptation discussions or meetings or financial mechanisms. So I know the screen is small, but if anyone, let's shout out. If you see the word health, or if you find Wally first, then you must tell me. So health isn't yet included in any of the word health is not on the slide. And in fact, the two largest climate financing mechanisms, they both have around 250 agencies who are approved to disperse funds. So you have these mechanisms which contain funding, and then they get dispersed through agencies, UNDP, UNEP, a whole range of 250 agencies. But there's not a single health agency which is accredited to receive funding. So health hasn't yet entered that space, but has tremendous potential too, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So this is the Presidential Climate Commission in Africa. And again, I ask two questions. Can anyone, so those who are not from South Africa, this is a little bit of unfair competition, but can anyone see anyone who's from the health sector, or from WITS for that matter? Ah. That was in my speech, and my notes was when I was meant to take a drink of water. So there's a range of ministers and other stake players, but there's not anyone from health. There's also not anyone from WITS. But I blame the absence of WITS on people like Professor Muddy and Venter and Glenda Gray and others. It's the last time government let them into these kind of command council and these other things. It didn't work out so well for them. I think they decided this is going to be quite a long time before they will include us going forward. So again, the question is, where's Wally? Okay, so I'm going to continue discussing the climate finance space and just how ripe it is for the health sector to intervene. The oil industry every single day earns $3 billion profit. That's not coal, natural gas, or any of the other fossil fuels. So over the last 10 years, the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest climate funding mechanism, has dispersed 0.8 billion to help to assist the world. This is globally. Assist small island states, to assist farmers, to assist any coping, they assist the world to cope with climate change. It's very real, shocking occurrence at the moment. And during that time period, the oil industry was earning that 10 trillion. But what's interesting is that 0.8, those funds have a large amount of money that is unspent. That 0.8 was what dispersed. Approved grants is more than twice that. Because the other sectors, remember, health is not a player yet. The other sectors really struggle to spend. And so there's very little demand. So health has never yet submitted an application for funding, and there's nothing stopping us from doing that. We've had quite a few interactions, and I've had several calls with Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund, and there's really and they really would welcome a health application. And in the health sector, we know how to run these programs. We have these platforms. Nutrition and other sectors, and housing and water, it's really hard for them to get projects together. We have these platforms. We showed in PEPFAR, for example, where we can spend, there's $9 billion have come through PEPFAR and Global Fund in the last 10 years. And in one project alone that WITS RHI is running, in two sub-districts, Ekurhuleni and Tshwane, that's $500 million that we have for those just two sub-districts alone. And that is not that far off what has happened globally. So there really is a massive demand and a huge gap that we could fill in the health sector. So one of the ways that we've begun to take up this challenge and to make these health sector projects is what's called the Chance Network. So this was conceptualized by myself and Stanley Luchters. It was after I'd been involved in evaluation with UNICEF. We tried to examine how did PMTCT, or the Prevention of Mother-to-Child Transmission of HIV, how did this land up being so successful? What was the key mechanisms? And the one thing that came through was getting all African countries together. We then developed common guidelines, a common strategy, a common communication with funders. It was really key to that process. So in one of our grants, the NBAL grant, we wrote in to have these annual meetings. I think it was 11 or 12 countries came together, very senior leaders, and Minister Barbara Creasy spent 2 hours with us discussing and how can this mechanism work across Africa. And I'm really convinced that this is the way forward, and we have about 4 to 5 years of funding to really take this approach forward, which I really think is key. So I have two main conclusions to make. The first is that we really need to rapidly build these research teams on climate change and health in Africa. Africa is the continent that is worst affected by climate change. It's the least responsible for emissions, but it also has the least ability to adapt, or the least capacity to face the onslaught. It also, unfortunately, has the least ability to secure financial reparations or to secure financing. And climate change has this really thick strand of climate justice to it. The floods in Mozambique, which really severely damaged Beira, for example, that was caused by climate change, and climate change is caused by emissions over the last 2 centuries in the northern hemispheres. And yet Mozambique was left to carry that as a debt. There's no sense of reparations. There hasn't been a sense of reparations in slavery or colonialism either. There's a real sense of bygones, or let's forget about what's happened. So there is really important to build these research teams. There's massive gaps in knowledge. And unfortunately, this shows how challenging this will be. So this is the set of research centers on heat and health throughout the world. It's 2 or 3 years old. But it still shows the challenges that we face in this field. And remember, Africa is the most affected. There's many parts of Africa which were unlivable, if you think of the Sahara. And those areas are rapidly increasing, areas of unlivability increasing, but also unworkability. So there's areas that are now too hot for you to live, and that area will expand. And there's areas which you no longer can work for several months of the year. You have to migrate and perhaps come back. So Africa is really heavily affected, but we have, at that point, we had no research centers. So the slide did change, in case you didn't realize. This is a slide of the location of members of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. And this is the most important mechanism in the world for examining the impacts of climate change. It's been going since 2012, and it really is the key mechanism in the world. It does remarkable work, and it has 97, 98 really committed, excellent scientists involved in that commission. And their job is really to understand what's happening in climate change throughout the world. There is only a single African in that group, and there's 1 or 2 from other low middle-income countries. So the question is, if those commissions and other leading bodies in the world are not representative of the communities which are most affected, or those areas in the world which are really struggling, then are they really fully able to understand the conditions of that is happening in Africa? It is understandable that those commissions don't mirror the burden of disease, because remember in that previous slide, they just didn't have this capacity for experts. The experts weren't yet present in the African continent. So there are reasons that it's not yet representative. But our point is that we need to have representation in Africa in climate change and health. And that will come from building these massive research programs. And it would work exactly in the other direction. And the Northern Hemispheres too would need to have they would need to have people on their climate change committees who would be able to understand what's just happened in that picture. So for many people living in the United Kingdom, many of them would have not seen yellow grass before their whole life. You were a 90-year-old, I imagine, who's never, 90 years yet seen a piece of yellow grass. The closest she came was watching an exotic movie out of Africa or something. She's not yet seen grass. And for many people in the UK, for a lot of their lives, the temperature was never above 18. And yet for that person to now have a temperature of 40, what is happening in her head, and how would I be able to fully understand the implications for a 90-year-old in the UK who has a chronic heart or renal disease to be now in a temperature of 40? And to have this this drought in the Thames is at a level that's I couldn't fully understand that. And the point is this, and this is this year. This is not the new normal. Sometimes people say, the climate is now new normal. No. This is the baseline. With every year, next year, when we look at the same picture, you will see that the yellow extends even further. We have 4 large projects. So we have come some way towards developing this African capacity. We have 4 projects. And we've built up, in those 4 projects, sites throughout Africa which do really important field work in this area, or are part of our data science consortium. So when we started, remember it was around 7 years ago, it was myself and Stanley Luchtis, and over the years, him and I have conceived these 4 projects I'm discussing. And no one knew us at that point. No one in the climate change and health space had heard of Chersich Luchtis. And they didn't even know how to pronounce my surname at that time. And we were worried, how would we find partners? Because at that time, much of the funding was structured around that you needed to have European partners involved. And at that time, we didn't really understand climate change. We really did need European partners. And we were worried perhaps we wouldn't find any people willing to engage with these 2 little bit eccentric Africans. But we were surprised. We landed up with a whole number of European partners, as you'll see. This is also where my note says it's time to take a drink. So in our 4 projects, we managed to involve a whole number of the key. In fact, I would say we're partners with almost all of the key European and some of the key American partners in this field. What's very interesting is that over this time, in our next 4 projects we're working on now, the funders have changed. There's this big shift. They understand the need for this African cohort of researchers, so that we can fully examine and we can start to do these interventions that are needed as the temperature warms rapidly. And the funders too are really promoting an African researchers. So interestingly, in our next 4 projects which we're working on now, solely have no European or US partners. They're completely African based. And I think that's quite interesting. That's the kind of movement that's needed to really fully get engaged across Africa. Build up this core of researchers that can then start getting this climate financing going. So our strategies weren't only to build this East, West, South and Central African research partners. Within the Faculty of Health Sciences, we've also begun to reach out to different groups. And again, we've been very, very warmly welcomed by a whole number of fellow researchers in the faculty. Unfortunately, you can't see it so clearly, but and maybe just to highlight 2, the VIDA group has kindly shared their data for some of our projects, and Zinsha has also kindly shared a lot of their data with us for our heat center work. Ian Sanna and Neil Martinson have been very supportive. Prof. Manga is running a special edition for the faculty. So slowly but surely, we're drawing researchers within the faculty into this space. There is an immense mismatch between the demand for information, the funding available to meet that demand, and the supply of proposals. The adaptation fund in our conversation is, please send us a proposal, but we're a team of 12, which is a fantastic number. 12 is, for a whole range of reasons, a really important number in many parts of the history of the world or similar. So 12, we're a team of 12, which is fantastic, but there's this demand which we're hoping that others in the faculty and across Africa will begin to meet. Some people ask, how would you enter? There's a lot of confusion. How does one enter the field of climate change and health? It's a new field, and people may want. I get this quite frequently. I'm very interested in climate. I care about the future for my children, and it's a new field. It's an exciting field. Every week there's a shift, and there's another climate crisis. And so the message on this in the next series of slides is to be vigilant and be creative. This is a rapidly evolving and all sorts of associations that one might not be immediately apparent. So in this case, this is a personal story. There was a time when I had listeria endophthalmitis. I ended up going blind in the eye. I could only see movement, hand movement, but I couldn't count fingers. So I was there was a very rare disease. I was case number 42 that I could locate in a systematic review. If you ever have a rare disease, then do a systematic review on yourself. And I also wrote it up as a case study within this article. So I was number 42. I felt quite special. That's more or less where South Africa finishes in the Olympic medal list. And so I thought that was... so we wrote this and I had Dr. Krish and a whole range of excellent care at that time. And but we were living in Italy when we went back, and the uveitis lead in Italy lived in the north, and I would catch a train we went as a family to go and visit him. And in one of our conversations, I asked him, "Would you like to write an article with me?" And he was very interested, and we wrote an article together. But at that point, I started wondering, is there a link between climate change and listeria? And this is why I'm showing you this picture. Is that we need to think creatively around these links. And it landed up that David Moore he'd been thinking about listeria in a clever way, and he'd put these links together. But I think I wasn't that far off in the thinking, because we know that all infections are related, not all, but most infections, and especially new infections, are related to man's intrusion into nature. HIV, MERS, SARS, COVID-1 and 2. COVID were about us and nature having this unhealthy relationship. And climate change is really affecting all infections and the distribution of infections. And then that led me to then write another piece on climate change and diarrhea. So what I'm not suggesting anybody gets listeria, ocular listeria. But what I am suggesting here is that you keep your sense of where the opportunities are. This field is evolving so rapidly that there's clearly many opportunities for picking up different parts. And so there'll come a point in the College of Medicine or in the deanery where there'll be a tipping point, I think. We'll carry on increasing our work and we'll take on more and more interesting things. The climate will continue the natural world will continue to break down. And there will come a certain point where I think the field of climate change will really expand. We'll have our own department of climate change. And in time, I'm hoping that we'll join one of the colleges and become a college of climate change and health over time. That's my vision for this expansion. So this is my final conclusion, is that really public health is about more than just treating a disease. Our work in tobacco, was it really about just treating lung cancer and emphysema? In alcohol, do we just do liver cirrhosis? Or is it around tackling what are the causes of this disease? We tackle the alcohol industry, we tackle the tobacco industry, etc. And this for me applies in the exact same way, that we can't, as the health profession, solely focus on treating the manifestations of climate change and health. It's the exact same logic. We need to get involved in the prevention. And in this case, the prevention is around tackling the fossil fuel industry and its proponents. And the health sector, I really believe, is very, very well suited to do this, because we understand the tricks and the tricksters of industry. We know from when one is dealing with the pharmaceutical industry that you can get tremendous value from research with them. Our university in HIV and in COVID has done remarkable research while working very closely with industry, with the pharmaceutical industry. But we also understand that we have very divergent values and very different goals. Their goals are not our shared goals. And we know that we need to keep them at a certain distance from us. And we know that we also need to be wary of many of their actions. They have a certain playbook, and it's remarkable. The playbook of the alcohol industry, tobacco industry, Nestle, fossil fuels, it's the exact same. They have a bag of tricks, and they apply that in all of our interactions with health. The sugar industry, meat industry, it's a universal bag strategies that they use. The health sector too has strategies, and again, it's near universal. We apply taxation, we apply warning labels. In this case, it'd be warning labels at the petrol tank, warning labels on red meat, and we know we block advertising. We've learned a whole range of strategies to control industry. We also know the boundaries between us and industry, and just how important it is to maintain these boundaries. And I want to give you two things to think about as they relate to Wits University. And to take maybe one step back from that, if you have to think, where will this change come about? Sorry, let's take one step back. The world needs this incredibly massive change or shift in behaviors, in energy source, in almost all spheres of life. We need to change markedly. So who will drive that change? Where will this come about? Will it be from governments? With that amount of oil money floating around, is it realistic to believe that the governments are not pliable in some way to this amount of money that's moving around? And I think it's clear that would be naive to think so. Will it come from the general public? And yes, that is probably true, but only after a social tipping point. Only at a certain point, once the world, like with tobacco, everyone was smoking, but at a certain point, there was a social tipping point for tobacco, drinking and driving, etc. So someone needs to drive that social tipping point. And I suggest it's not governments, it's not the general population. Activists have a key role to play, but alone, I'm not sure that they will be able to manage to drive this absolute change that is required in the world, and this absolute pushback and control of blockage and boundaries of industry. So who we left with? Civil society is important, but in my view, it's really the intelligentsia, it's the universities, it's the academics, are one of the few possibilities for making this change. And remember, it's climate choice. We have about 10 years before it becomes climate cascade, after which point we have very little control. So in these 10 years, in my view, it's really the universities have a key role to play, and particularly I think the health faculty. So back to my question around Wits. It's complex, but I want to give you two examples. The first one is that the vice chair of the council is from Sasol, and now Sasol is a complex a fossil fuel company. They one of the world's largest emitters. They produce more emissions than Sweden and Kenya combined. And they're also a company that is pretty lax when it comes to emission controls, to meeting standards. They also enjoy government subsidies. And of course, we know government subsidies should really at this point be channeled towards renewable energy. It shouldn't still be going to fossil fuel industry. So Sasol is really a problematic company in many ways. And is this really the kind of company that the university, the people lead in this company, is that really the kind of organization we should turn to for complex philosophical questions or complex questions? And what are the optics of that? The second point I want to raise, and this is really important from the health sciences perspective, is we understand the dangers of misinformation, of denialers. We know the dangers of Dr. Roth and President Thabo Mbeki, these denialers, how much damage they cause. We know from COVID, how much damage does vaccine denialers cause? And we know that we just can't give them oxygen. You just can't, people who don't use scientific methods, really we need to know how dangerous they are, particularly those who are funded by industry. And Wits says this, quite a strange, there was one incident where there was quite a strange interaction with a denialist who was warmly welcomed on our campus. So for me, I find this dissonance, where I think the university has this tremendous role to play in becoming really this Africa stronghold, this massive leader on climate change in the world. The funders all want to work with us. The demand for information is almost limitless in some way. And yet, on the other hand, our university seems somewhat reluctant to embrace this as a whole. There's a reluctance to even begin a discussion around disinvestment. And we haven't yet moved to a point where we then have this complete harmony between making research and also trying to shift and prevent disease. So I wrote a letter to the CEO of Shell. I played this out in my head. Would this kind of work in the University of Amsterdam? Would Shell be the vice chancellor of this? So I sent him a letter. I haven't got a reply, but I think it's partially because he would struggle to read my handwriting. Because at heart I do remain partially a clinician. And my handwriting hasn't improved since those days. So one of the points that I'd like to make is around the difficulties with people working in climate change when it comes to money from the fossil fuel industry. And this is something I've been pushing for a few years now. And it relates to really that we need to make sure our financial interests are very different to the industry's financial interests. Or if they land up that we are receiving money from industry, we really need to openly declare that. And that would apply for the pharmaceutical research, for multiple different forms of research. And for those who don't know, there is a guideline that we use whenever we write an article or we do a public presentation. We need to declare our interests. We need to say, have we received any financial or any other interests related to the topic we're working on? And be quite open. There's very few weasel words here, unfortunately. We must declare anything that could give the appearance of potentially influencing what was written in the submitted work. So in my case, I received direct financial reward from the fossil fuel industry, as does our university from investments. And so this for me is something that needs to be declared when one writes journal articles and so on. And I think this will become something over time that people will take up, and it will become universal practice. So finally, I'd like to finish on something more of a philosophical note. And this is some work over the years. I've been fortunate to work with a range of Jesuits. This is Peter Knox, who's in charge of the Jesuit University in Nairobi in East Africa. He's in charge of the Peace Studies Department. So it comes down to really kind of, this is a decision that humankind needs to make at this point. Is nature our slave, our master, or our family, really? So the ancient religions, one thinks of the Egyptians or many of the religions in North America, the traditional religions, they worshipped nature. The Egyptians had a god of the sun god. Worshipped there, they had great value, placed great value on the Nile River. Some religions worship mountains and nature. Those religions revered nature and saw ourselves as somehow the subjects of nature or dependent on nature, dependence. But somehow there was an interpretation in Judeo-Christianity of man being in dominion, that we are the masters of the earth, and the earth is our servant, in fact our slave often. Many would say we have an abusive relationship with nature. And if a species goes extinct, we don't even mourn it, we don't even know. This is this perfect creature, perfect plant or animal that is now extinct because of our behaviors. We don't even know. We have a very master-slave relationship with the earth. And that is really what underlies the problems that we're facing. This underlies climate change and many other problems. There's a third way, and this is what St. Francis said in much of his writings. So he spoke to nature as a family. He had brother, sun, sister, moon. And he spent a lot of time with nature and speaking to nature in harmony. And as this image of a family, which is a loving relationship he had with nature. He was considered the first Christian environmentalist. And really that's the kind of relationship I think that we need to build as a world. Because ultimately, if we continue this notion where we think that we are in charge and that nature is our slave, we will learn one way or the other that that isn't the case. Nature is showing us that actually she's in charge, as much as we would like to think that's not the case. So Greta Thunberg had this very beautiful analogy that humans think that the world is an infinite jar of cookies that we can just keep eating. We can eat the forest, we can eat the rivers, we can eat the fish. We can just keep eating from nature, and somehow nature will just keep replenishing itself. This goes back to the climate choice analogy. If the right is the temperature of 1.5 increase. Remember, we're at 1.1. So when we say 1.1, that's the average increase. You then get these bursts of heat waves. They're two separate things. So it's inevitable that we will reach this 1.5. It seems there's no other pathway where it doesn't happen that we reach 1.5. In other words, 0.5 above where we are, and these more intense heat waves. If we carry on eating from this cookie jar, we'll end up there at 2 degrees warmer. And you can see in Africa, many parts of Africa will warm at twice the global rate. So that's 4 degrees warmer than pre-industrial time. And if we just continue on this current trajectory, and by the way, there's been absolutely no change in emissions. They keep increasing, the relentless increase. So we really are on the current way that humans behave. We're on that trajectory towards that 4 degrees. And at that point, many, many parts of the world are unlivable. So really what we do need to do, and I brought this with, this is how we think things are. But this is the reality of the situation. Really down to our last few biscuits. And at this point in time, we really need to stop the eating. And the question as us as a faculty is, what does that really mean practically? And how do we start doing this disease prevention? To stop the eating before it's too late. And indeed, that's also linked to stop the meeting. But that's a story for another day, but equally important to the fossil fuel industry. So it comes down in a way, what kind of world are we going to hand to our children and to our grandchildren? And ultimately, it's very difficult for individuals to make that choice. It's a systemic thing. So we're the ones who need to fight that system, and we can. We've done it before. So that we make sure that the world is at least mostly habitable for our children to come. So I'd like to acknowledge the large number of partners who've worked with us. And over the last 7 years, as I said, we've built up really a fantastic relations across the world in our project so far. And these are funded. We've got a whole range of very generous funders who've backed our team. Really, we started from scratch, and somehow they saw the potential in our team, and we've developed really strong relations with our funders, especially with the NIH, who fund 2 of our projects. And then, of course, within WITS RHI, as I said, Helen Rees has backed me from day one. She didn't even think about it for a minute, I don't think. And of course, Gloria, who's my director now, and the whole team, the WITS directorate. We started with the WITS directorate, but at some point we'll hopefully have the WITS Department of Climate Change. And of course, the whole, the WITS RHI team, the whole house of WITS. It's very important to note that this isn't only my work, by no means. All of the studies we've done so far, all the first 4 and the first 4 and the next 4 that we are working on now, were done in collaboration with Stanley Luchters. So that map node isn't the distribution of research centers, and it's not the Lancet countdown authors. It's the areas where me and Stanley have gone over the years. And this, if I recommend this, if there's any message I can give to the emerging researchers, is find someone who you get on well with. Find someone who's super smart, and go away for these weeks at a time. We would go between 7 and 10 days away together, just the 2 of us. And we'd spend this time together, writing these grants, writing articles, fully immersed in in this work. And of course, before Stanley, there was a whole range of other people who've been at the heart of my academic growth. And this is just 2 examples. There was someone like Mike Urban, and others who've really been supporting and guiding me the whole way through my academic career. So I'm left to say thank you for this opportunity and for listening. And it's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Matthew. A very provocative talk. And I think it raises a number of issues, which, as you correctly point out, it's not just for the faculty to address, but for the university to address. And to some extent, I think the university has got a commitment in doing so, and that's the reason why they established a specific post in the university that's headed by Prof. Imran Valodia to look at the issue of climate change in the context of where we operate. So at this point, I would like to invite Prof. Helen Rees to give a vote of thanks, after which we will invite you to join us for refreshments outside. Thanks.
So, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, and Professor Matthew Chersich. I think Matthew requires a huge round of applause. So I think the first thing I would open up with, given that you ended on Wits, was that last week I was chatting to the Vice-Chancellor, and I think, Matthew, to know you is to be frightened, because Professor Vilakazi said to me, there's the inaugural lecture coming, and he said, Matthew, also couldn't pronounce your surname, but he said, he gave us such a hard time, but he really put pressure on us, and he talked about your activism. And then I said, no, but you're a really good academic as well. So I defended you. But it was interesting that his reflection was about the passion and the activism that you have drawn attention to this issue for Wits, and he really recognized that. I think this was such an incredible tour de force of a talk, opening up a new area that needs to be really, I think you've just demonstrated it so well, that we know relatively little about, we know very few solutions. But a couple of things really struck me in what you said. I mean, in your last map about the yellow grass, we now all know today, as of 24 hours, that Europe has got the worst heat wave in 500 years. But look what's happening in the Horn of Africa. And has anyone really noted what's happening in the Horn of Africa? Multiple countries, huge displacement of populations, whose level, as you said, in the poverty is just sitting here. And we don't notice it. The second thing that really struck me was what you were saying about African leadership. Because I think we've all heard with COVID, the huge demands now, it's coming out with monkeypox as well, to say we want African leadership. We keep neglecting the fact that we have excellent scientists in the African region, and we want this African leadership. So I think an acknowledgement to you. Thank you so much for really being at the forefront of doing this. Just overall, every new discipline, every new sort of thought. Many of us were at the beginning when we started to think about HIV. Every new topic that comes up starts somewhere and starts with the sort of the assembling of what do we currently know, and then moves into what can we do. And I think the university and the faculty must be incredibly proud, Matthew, that you've actually taken this initiative. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge Robert, Ethel, and Fiona, and Dylan. You know your father, partner, son better than anybody, and I think you can be very proud today, because Matthew, the takeaway, and I'm going back to what Zeblon said, is that you're an extraordinary academic. You deserve the recognition you have academically, but you're also a really tough activist. And you don't take prisoners. And one of the nice things about you is that you say what you think. Sometimes it's quite difficult. I mean, I saw Shabir sort of wriggling in his seat a bit there. But you really say, you talk truth to power. And as much as you're an outstanding academic, you're also an outstanding activist. And I think that we would all want to see, on behalf of WITS, we would want to see you, and to build this up. And we have Gloria here, we have your HEAT team members here and online, and I've got to give you a gift on behalf of everybody who wants to say a sincere thank you to you for your initiatives. Well done, and we all look forward to this really growing and going further forward. Thanks, well done.